surface level way.
Except for this. I did a debate in a Church of Christ where I told him I could write a better book than the Bible, and I could prove it to him. Because I could rewrite it word for word, reverse its position on slavery, and it would be a better book. Because for the people who are looking at this, not so much as metaphorical lessons or like that, if they're looking at this as an instruction book for life, that book advocates slavery. That's not even a question. If you were to say, thou shalt not own a human being as property, that would be better than saying you can, and that you can pass them on. And so this was the example I used for the people who are kind of like Bible worshipers, not the people who go in looking for, hey, there's an interesting message here, or they're going to tell me something about my life, but no, this is literally word for word, blah, that type of mindset.
Which was Jesus' mindset about Scripture.
Is probably more responsible for the harm and damage that a lot of us would lay at the foot of Christianity than Glenn's version, for sure. I mean, I don't think Glenn's pro-slavery at all. And when you start looking at things where you are finding a way to take a message that could easily be viewed as this is a blood magic sacrifice and say, well, life has to consume life to exist, and you want to kind of maybe blow off why God would have made it that way or why it had to be made that way, which is a weird and interesting theological discussion. Getting rid of those things and keeping the good parts is all I've advocated for ever. And secular humanism, to me, is taking the good parts, whether they're found in Christianity, Judaism, Scientology.
And who's deciding on, in a sense, and the good is simply defined by what you regard as the measure of human well-being, and anything that basically points us in that direction.
Yeah, and it's not fully defined or anything else. But to pretend that we don't have some beginning understanding of it, I think is a bit ridiculous.
Okay. So so I think very briefly, in a sense, that Matt is sketching out this idea that there is a secular morality.
Well, there's an example that came along with this that Glenn produced when he was listing off societal health versus religiosity and teeing me up for the Gregory S. Paul thing. He mentioned divorce rates. But that comes with the presumption that divorce is a bad thing.
Sure.
And I don't believe that. I'm recently divorced. Me and my ex-wife are as good friends now as we ever were, and we're both in agreement that it was absolutely the right thing for us to do. And so what's happened here is, from my perspective, and obviously people can disagree, religious thinking, religious teaching, religious dogma has done a number of great disservices to human beings by setting up a notion of a soulmate, by setting up the notion that marriage needs to be one man, one woman forever. That's caused countless problems. By setting up a view of death that does not allow people to deal with that. If we started with the notion that death is the eventual consequence of life, it would fundamentally change, and that was the end as far as we knew, and anything else would be a bonus. It would fundamentally change, I think, how we treated people while they were still alive. And so there's a number of problems here that are rooted in the theology, rooted in the notion that there's a God, which I think if you set those aside and just focus on the things that actually directly try to benefit human beings, it has to be better.
So it's all the benefits of Christianity plus a few more, because you haven't got some of the baggage, essentially.
Well, Matt said that he could write a Bible that's superior to the Bible by reversing its position on slavery. I think if you started from scratch without the Bible, though, I don't think you, and I don't think anyone has, written a book or a series of books or a collection of books, a library of books, that has done what the Bible has done for slavery in the world. Because slavery is a human universal, and it has not been overturned by anyone other than those who took the Bible seriously back in the 18th century. There were evangelical Christians, there were Quakers, there were people who took the Bible seriously. So
parts of it seriously.
It's a longer discussion about how you take the Old Testament. But
okay, so it's a long discussion about how you take the Old Testament. Did any of you see the discussion? I saw just some portions of it. I didn't follow any of the threads. But day before yesterday, I know it was continued yesterday, so I think it was the day before yesterday, there was a statement made about the American form of incarceration being a form of slavery. And pretty hard to argue against that. When you put someone in chains in a cage for a lengthy period of time, that is a form of slavery. The freedom's gone. And in fact, it's in many ways it's worse than the old form of slavery, because back then you couldn't leave the plantation, but you had a wife and you had kids and your family, and you could walk in the fields and stuff like that, and instead of being in solitary confinement or stuck with a bunch of other guys in in a cell block someplace. And a lot of people have made the point that there really isn't a meaningful biblical foundation for mere incarceration as being an issue of justice. Under biblical law, if you stole from somebody, you had to pay back with reparation what you stole. And so the idea would be, if you do something to someone, then you have to repay. You have to not be losing your liberty doesn't do anything for the victim. And so there was a discussion going on as what is more biblical, because there are numerous forms of slavery in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Now, in the New Testament, you don't have laws establishing forms of slavery. You have exhortations to those who are already in a culture, which every culture up to that point in time had forms of slavery of one kind or another. I suppose you could find exceptions somewhere, but Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, this was the context. And so in the New Testament, you have exhortations: if you are a slave, do not rebel against your master, but seek your own freedom. It is better to be free. So if you can bring that freedom about, as there were people in the narrative of the New Testament who had accomplished that. But in the Old Testament, you have different kinds. You have voluntary slavery. Sounds weird, isn't it? But that's because it was an economic thing. And then you have the issues of war. And what people don't understand, and I, again, went over this in the Holiness Code series a number of years ago, but a lot of people, even the vast majority of my friends, haven't listened to all that, and I fully understand why. But the reality is that, and Dillahunty doesn't understand this, and I would not hold an atheist accountable to accurately representing the Bible at this point anyways, because I just wouldn't expect it. If you can't accurately represent the doctrine of the Trinity, I hardly expect you to accurately represent this either. But when someone says that, well, the Bible just simply could have said this and stopped all of it, what they're not understanding is that what that would mean, especially in the war context, was that you'd be raising the black flag. Do you know what raising the black flag means? In Western war, to raise the black flag meant you're not taking prisoners. You all wounded, all who try to surrender will be killed. Why do I say that? It's real simple. What slavery allowed in war situations was for life to continue. Because when you destroyed the men of a culture and the crops and the houses, what are you going to do with the women and the children? They're not going to be able to survive. You're talking, remember, you're talking subsistence level existence at this time. You're not there. There wasn't any Red Cross, which is was founded by Christians. There wasn't any Red Cross to come in and provide food and water. If in a war situation, you wiped out the men and you wiped out the crops in the process, they're going to die. They're going to starve to death. They're either going to be eaten by wild animals or they're going to starve to death. So when people complain about the slavery situation, well, it's just, it was the mechanism for the preservation of innocent life. So you had the war situation, and then you had the economic situation, where if, there were droughts and diseases and all sorts of things that would happen, that even if you worked extremely hard, might put yourself in a position where you could no longer provide for your family. the law allowed for indentured servitude, as we would call it, or slavery, where you could sell yourself and your family to someone so that they might live. And here's the issue. We are so individualistic in Western society that we're with Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. That's not a biblical concept. Paul writes to the Christians, and he writes to slaves, and he writes to those who are not going to be able to bring about their freedom, and says, glorify God in whatever situation you find yourself to be in. Even in the service of your master, you're actually serving Christ. That's what he said. Deal with it. Deal with the reality of the fact that the New Testament gospel goes out into a world where slavery is a reality. And it is not a message that says, rebel and start revolution right now. Just doesn't. You can pretend, you can do whatever, you can rightly say that Scripture says you are not to steal people. And the black slavers in Africa that stole blacks from neighboring tribes and sold them, the vast majority going to the West Indies and to what we would call the Caribbean today, not to the United States, but they did come there. That was sinful. Paying money for that, sinful. No two ways about it. No question about it. But don't be like the atheist who sits here in the 21st century and completely ignores the reality of what was going on back then and say, I could write a better book than the Bible. And in doing so, what you're doing is you are condemning all these people to death by starvation. That's what you're doing. He just made the Bible a better book by ignoring the fact that it's had to exist for over 3,000 years. And the world is not the same today as it was 3,000 years ago. So since things have changed since then we need to look at what the contexts were and make proper application from there, which is what led to the abolitionist movement and things like that. But that takes time. And it's so simplistic to go, oh, you should just automatically know. You should just automatically know. Well, then what do you do with Philemon? What do you do with 1st and 2nd Timothy? What do you do with Titus? What do you do with Ephesians? They just should have known. No, you're wrong. You are trying to turn the Bible into a 21st century document with 21st century tastes and predilections, rather than recognizing that this revelation has been used by God and that every generation has to make application, and that it is amazing that we can do so, and we can do so by looking at the context and by understanding what happened in the past, where we are now, and that there are laws of general equity that we can apply and that we can understand in our day. And so when I hear Matt Dillahunty saying, I can write a better book, he's just ignorant of history. It's just a surface level response. But let's be honest, how many Christian apologists are even going to push back? They're just going to accept the idea. Well, yeah, and you know how we do with the Old Testament. And again, I understand the time pressure. I get it. You're on a program. I can say this with absolute honesty. I've been in the same studio. Okay, I haven't been on, this is the big discussions. That was actually videotaped. So I haven't done that, but how many times have I been on Unbelievable? I understand. And Justin will tell you, and I think Justin would agree if someone asked him this. Does James White work with you when it comes to keeping a program moving, time, getting things done? And Justin will say, yes, because I've done radio for most of my life. And so I fully understand time constraints, all the rest of that kind of stuff. So I get it. And I might have to very, 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 very briefly say something, but I would try to say something. I would want to push back instead of just going, well, how you deal with the Old Testament, that's a tough issue. Would that, a lot of people would say, no, that you can't do it. But the fact is, the atheist can read the Bible just like I can. And they can go to the same text that I go to and say, hey, the New Testament has exhortations to those who own slaves and to those who are slaves. So I could make it better. Well, you could make it a document that would require the destruction of the Roman Empire for the gospel to go out. But that's not making the Bible better. That's showing a fundamental ignorance of how the Bible has functioned down through history, all the way back to its inception, all the way back to, I would say, personally, 1,400 years before the birth of Christ. So that's what I'm saying when I say, how many, and I don't know what Glenn Scrivener's background is, and again, I think he did a good job. We're contrasting this not by means of trying to say, I could have done better. I would have handled it differently in certain places. The emphases would have been different. Would that have resulted in different objections from Matt Dillahunty? Maybe, I don't know. But by providing the contrast, you and the audience have to sit back and go, okay, well, where do I come down on that? Because there's some of you sit in the audience that go, well, I hear what he's saying, but I will never agree with anything this guy says as long as he's wearing one of those sweaters. And if that's the way you think, then great. But as I've said in many of my classes for a long, long time, you may disagree with what I have to say. I'm just going to force you to understand why you disagree and to think through the foundations of why you would reject what it is I have to say. So that's the important part. All right?